2 days before the Passover, the festival of unleavened bread. The chief religious leaders were looking for a way to arrest him in secret and put him to death, but they said not during the festival. Might cause a riot. While he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive ointment of nard. She broke open the jar and poured it over his head. Some sitting nearby were saying in anger, "Well, why has the ointment been wasted like that? This ointment could have been sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor," when they scolded her. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a good service for me. You will always have the poor with you and can show kindness to them whenever you please, but you won't always have me." She did what she could. She anointed my body with oil beforehand for my burial. Honestly, I'm telling you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief religious leaders and offered to betray him. When they heard it, they were overjoyed and offered to give him money. Money. First day of unleavened bread, this Passover lamb was sacrificed. His disciples went to him and said, "Where do you want us to go to make preparations for you to eat the Passover meal?" So he sent 2 of them and said, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher asks, 'Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready." So they set off, and they found everything exactly as he had said. The Passover meal. That evening, Jesus arrived with the 12. When they had taken their places at the table and were eating, he says, "You know, one of you will betray me. One who is sitting at the table here with me." They all got into an uproar and said one after another, "Well, it can't be me, can it?" And he said, "It is. One of the 12. One who is dipping bread in a bowl with me. You know, the Son of Man goes as is written of him, but damn the one by whom he is betrayed." Better for that one not to have been born. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread. Looking up, he blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. He said, "Have some. It's is my body. And after they had eaten, he took a cup. And after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all ate from it, drank from it, drank from it. He said, "This cup is my blood of the covenant poured out for many. Honestly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in God's domain." After they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. He was saying to them, "You know, you will all become deserters, just as it's written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised, I will go before you into Galilee." Peter said, "Well, they might all desert you, but I won't." Jesus said, "This day, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said emphatically, he said, "No, even if I have to die with you, no way I will ever deny you." They all said the same thing. He came to Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter and James and John and began to become agitated, distressed. He said, "I'm dying of grief. Wait here and keep awake." And he went on a little further and threw himself to the ground and began to pray that the hour would pass from him. He said, "Papa, Father, anything's possible for you. Take this cup away from me. But not what I want, what you want." He came back and found them sleeping. He says to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? You couldn't keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake so that you won't be put to the time of trial. Oh, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again and prayed using the same words, and again he came back and found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy. They didn't know what to say. The 3rd time he came back and said, "Well, still sleeping, huh? Catching up on your rest. Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let's go. Look, my betrayer is here." And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, who was one of the 12, arrived with a mob armed with swords and clubs. Now the betrayer had given them a sign. He said, "The one I kiss is your man. Arrest him and take him away under guard." So Judas goes up to Jesus and says, "Rabbi." And he kissed him. Someone standing nearby drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And then Jesus said, "You came all the way out here armed with swords and clubs to arrest me like I'm some common criminal? Every day I was in the temple teaching. Why didn't you arrest me then?" Well, let the scriptures be fulfilled. And they all deserted him and ran away. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They took hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. They took Jesus to the high priest's house, And the chief religious leaders and the whole council were assembled, and Peter, meanwhile, had followed at a distance into the courtyard and was warming himself by the fire with the guards. So the chief religious leaders were trying to find evidence against him in order to put him to death, but they couldn't find any. And people gave false testimonies, and their testimonies didn't agree. Some even gave this false testimony. They said, well, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands and in 3 days build another not made with hands. But even on this testimony, their testimonies didn't agree. So the high priest stood up and said, well, you don't have an answer? What is it that they testify against you? But he remained silent. So again the high priest stood up and said, are you Messiah, Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, yeah, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in clouds of glory. And the high priest tore his vestments and said, what more evidence do we need? You heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. And they began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to strike him. And they were saying, prophesy, prophesy. And the guards also took him and beat him up. Meanwhile, out in the courtyard, one of the slave girls of the high priest sees Peter warming himself, and she goes over to where he was, and she stares at him, and she says, you were with this man, Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it. He said, I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. And he got up and went out into the forecourt, and a rooster crowed. A little while later, the slave girl comes along again, and she says to some people sitting nearby, she says, psst, hey, this man is one of them. But he denied it. A little while later, some of those sitting around said, yeah, you are one of them. You're a Galilean. And Peter started cursing and swearing. He said, I don't know this man you're talking about. And just then, the rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered what Jesus had said, that before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and cried and cried. First thing in the morning, the chief religious leaders and the council held a consultation, and they bound Jesus and led him out and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate says, you are king of the Judeans? He said, if you say so. Then the chief religious leaders brought out their long list of accusations. Pilate said, well, you don't have an answer? Look at the charges they're bringing against you. But he remained silent, made no further reply. Pilate was puzzled. Now, every year at the festival, he used to release for them a prisoner, anyone they asked for. Now, there was a man named Barabbas who was in prison with the rebels, who had committed murder during the insurrection. The crowd came together and began to demand that Pilate honor his custom. So Pilate stood up and said, well, would you like me to release for you the king of the Judeans? Pilate figured it was out of jealousy that some of the religious leaders had handed him over, but meanwhile those religious leaders were out stirring up the crowd to get him to release Barabbas instead. So again Pilate stood up and said, "Well then, what do you want me to do with the one you call king of the Judeans?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Why? He hasn't done anything wrong." But they shouted back even more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and after flogging Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Well, then the guards took him to the governor's residence, and they dressed him in a purple cloak, and they twisted thorns into a crown and put it on him, and they began to salute him. They said, "Hail, King of the Judeans!" And they struck him and spit on him and knelt down in mock homage. And when they were finished mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put his own clothes back on him, and led him out to be crucified. They compelled a passerby who was just coming in from the country to carry the cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus, you know. They led him to a place called Golgotha, place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he wouldn't take it. So they crucified him. They cast lots for his clothes to see who would get what. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charges read, "King of the Judeans." They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his left and one on his right. Left, right, left, right, left. The people who were walking by were making fun of him. They said, "Ha ha, you who would destroy the temple and build another in 3 days? Save yourself. Come on down from that cross there." And some of the religious leaders were making fun of him too among themselves. They said, well, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now so we can see and believe. See and believe. And those who were crucified with him were taunting him too. At noon, darkness spread over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 3 o'clock, he cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you abandoned me? Some people standing nearby said, "Hey, listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone went and got a sponge, soaked it in sour wine, put it on the end of a pole, and offered it up to him. They said, "Wait, let's see if Elijah will come and rescue him. But just then, he gave out a loud cry.